My name is Evelyn Carter. I'm in my early 30s now, and for most of my adult life, I've worked in policy research, quiet rooms, long documents, decisions made without applause. I live a fairly ordinary life by most measures. I pay my bills. I show up on time. I'm the person people trust to keep things steady when emotions are high. People usually describe me as calm, reliable, the easy one, the kind of woman who doesn't make trouble, the kind of woman whose silence gets mistaken for agreement. What most people don't realize is that calm isn't the absence of memory, it's the result of it. This story isn't about revenge, it isn't about destroying anyone, and it's definitely not about dramatizing pain for clicks. It's about something much quieter than that. It's about what happens when trust is taken for granted, especially inside a family. It's about how harm doesn't always arrive loudly. Sometimes it comes disguised as convenience. And it's about how power doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it waits until it's undeniable. When I was younger, I believed that being low maintenance was a virtue. I believed that keeping the peace meant maturity. I believed that if I stayed patient long enough, people would eventually do the right thing. I was wrong about that last part. This story begins before I even understood money, credit, or contracts, before I had graduated from high school, back when I still assumed my name was safe, simply because it was mine. Years later, I was living in a dorm room, trying to build a future I thought was self-funded and honest, when the phone rang, then rang again, then again. That's when I found out when debt collectors called my dorm room. At first, I assumed there had been some administrative error. There always is, until there isn't. What followed wasn't a dramatic confrontation or a screaming match. It was a slow, sobering unraveling. A realization that my brother took out student loans in my name before I graduated high school, and that the people who should have protected me had found it easier to stay silent. This story will move through confusion, disbelief, and grief, but it will not rush them. There are no villains here with raised voices or clenched fists. Just people making choices, and someone else quietly living with the consequences. I'm telling this now not because it still hurts, but because it no longer controls me. If you've ever been the reliable one, if you've ever been underestimated because you didn't fight loudly, if you've ever discovered that silence has a cost, you'll understand this story. And maybe, as you listen, you'll recognize a moment when staying quiet stopped being passive and started being deliberate. Before we go further, I want to ask you something gently. Have you ever realized, too late, that someone else was making decisions using your name, before any paperwork, before phone calls from strangers, before I understood how debt could follow a person like a shadow? I was already playing a role in my family. I just didn't know it yet. To them, I was the easy one, not the gifted one, not the difficult one, not the one people worried about. I was the middle ground where expectations went to rest. I did well in school, without needing reminders. I didn't ask for much. I learned early how to make myself smaller in ways that looked like maturity. Adults praised me for being so independent. Relatives liked to say, "Evelyn will be fine." And my parents, well-meaning, exhausted, practical, treated that sentence like a fact instead of a hope. My brother, on the other hand, was different. Louder, more restless. He needed more help, more second chances, more explaining away. There was always a reason ready for his mistakes, always a story about potential, about pressure, about how things would turn around eventually. I watched this dynamic form without resentment at first. When you're young, you don't call it an imbalance, you call it normal. You learn that some people need more, and some people are expected to manage without. I was expected to manage. At family gatherings, I was the one asked to help set up, clean up, and keep an eye on things. Not because I was told to, but because everyone assumed I would. And I did. Quietly, efficiently, without comment. No one ever sat me down and said, "This is your role." But roles don't need to be announced to be enforced. By the time I was a teenager, teachers described me as self-directed. Guidance counselors nodded approvingly when I talked about college, as if my future were already sorted. At home, that translated into fewer questions, fewer check-ins, fewer safeguards. I didn't push back. Partly because I didn't know I could, partly because being agreeable felt safer than being seen as a problem. Invisibility has a way of disguising itself as trust. I shared a room with my brother for years. I heard his late-night worries, his frustrations, his fears about not measuring up. I listened more than I spoke. I thought that being understanding made me supportive. I thought that absorbing emotional weight without complaint was a form of loyalty. Looking back, I see how useful that made me. I was the sibling whose name sounded responsible, the one teachers liked, the one adults trusted by default. No one ever asked whether that trust came with consent. When I started applying for colleges, the assumption wasn't if I would go, but where. There were conversations happening around me about finances, about loans, about planning, but rarely with me. I thought that was just how adults handled things. I didn't know that decisions were being rehearsed in my absence. There's a particular kind of blindness that comes from being underestimated. People don't think to hide things from you if they don't believe you'll question them. They don't think to explain if they assume you'll go along. And I had spent years proving I would. I was dependable, predictable, quietly capable, which meant I was also convenient. At that age, I believed being trusted meant being safe. I believed that if something involved my name, someone would tell me. I believed that family lines couldn't be crossed without acknowledgement. What I didn't understand was that trust, when unexamined, can be repurposed. I wasn't invisible because I was unimportant. I was invisible because I was reliable. And reliability in the wrong hands becomes access. Nothing felt wrong yet. There were no alarms, no confrontations, no moments I could point to and say, this is where it started. That's the hardest part to explain to people now. Harm doesn't always begin with cruelty. Sometimes it begins with assumptions. Assumptions about who will notice, who will object, who will stay quiet. I stayed quiet. Not because I agreed, but because I didn't know there was anything to disagree with. Not yet. The first time something felt off, it was so minor I almost dismissed it out of habit. I was 17. Old enough to think I understood how the world worked, young enough to believe adults wouldn't cross certain lines. College applications were underway, acceptance letters trickling in, and my life felt like it was finally beginning to take shape. One evening, I came home to find my parents at the kitchen table with paperwork spread out between them. Forms, envelopes, the kind of documents that made the air feel heavier just by existing. They looked up, smiled, and said something vague, just figuring out next steps. Nothing about it sounded secretive, just managed. I remember hovering for a moment, waiting to be invited into the conversation. When that didn't happen, I poured myself a glass of water and went to my room. That was the rhythm we'd established. They handled things. I stayed out of the way. Later that night, my brother knocked on my door. He asked if I was excited about college. I said yes. He nodded, hesitated, then asked something else. Hey, he said carefully. Do you trust Mum and Dad with money stuff? The question landed oddly, like a puzzle piece from a different box. Of course, I said. Why? He shrugged. Just wondering. At the time, I laughed it off. Siblings ask strange questions. Families talk about things. Not everything needs an explanation. That was the first small cut. Not the question itself, but the way it left a faint awareness behind. A sense that something had brushed past me without fully touching me. A few weeks later, a letter arrived addressed to me. The return address was unfamiliar, official-looking. I didn't open it right away. I set it on the counter and forgot about it. By the next morning, it was gone. I assumed someone had moved it. I assumed I'd misplaced it. I assumed, as I always did, that there was a reasonable explanation. No one mentioned it. I didn't bring it up either. There's a particular silence that forms when everyone is being polite at the same time. It's not hostile. It's not tense. It's just curated, carefully remove the wrong questions. Over the following months, there were small moments like that. Conversations that stopped when I entered the room. Paperwork that seemed to rearrange itself when I wasn't looking. My name is mentioned in passing, always attached to phrases like, it'll be fine, or she won't have a problem with that. Each time, I felt a brief flicker of discomfort, then rationalized it away. They're stressed. They're doing their best. I don't need to be involved in everything. That was my internal script. The one that kept me compliant without being coerced. What's strange is that nothing felt malicious. No one treated me unkindly, no one raised their voice or demanded anything from me, which made it easier to ignore the fact that I was slowly being edited out of decisions that had my name on them. The first real moment of doubt came during a meeting with a school counsellor. She asked if I'd completed my financial aid paperwork. I think so, I said. My parents are helping. She nodded, clicked around on her screen, then paused. Well, she said carefully, it looks like some forms have already been submitted. I remember the heat that rushed to my face, not panic exactly, more like embarrassment, as if I'd missed an assignment everyone else had turned in on time. Oh, I said. Okay, that was it. That was the interior exchange. But something in me shifted. Not an alarm, not suspicion, just a quiet note in the back of my mind that said, you should probably ask more questions. I didn't, because asking questions felt like doubting the people who raised me. It felt ungrateful. It felt disruptive. And disruption wasn't my role. The first cut is never deep. It's a nick. A moment you could explain away to anyone who asked. A detail you'd feel silly mentioning out loud. But the body remembers. Even now, years later, I can trace the outline of that moment. Not as pain, but as awareness. For the first time, I sensed that something involving my future was happening just slightly out of reach. Everyone else moved on easily. I carried it quietly. And in doing so, I taught them something important about me. That I would notice and still stay silent. Once something goes unchallenged, it starts to feel permanent. After that first unease, life continued in ways that looked ordinary from the outside. Senior year deadlines, graduation plans, conversations about dorms and majors and what kind of person I was becoming. On the surface, everything pointed forward. Underneath, a pattern was settling in. I noticed it in the way decisions were summarized to me instead of discussed. How information arrived is already filtered, already framed as resolved. In how my consent was assumed through my silence. If I hesitated, it was smoothed over. It's already taken care of. You don't need to worry about that. This is just easier. Easier for whom was never clarified. At first, I told myself this was just what adulthood looked like. That families functioned on efficiency, not transparency. I was lucky to have parents willing to handle the complicated parts. So I stayed quiet. When mail came addressed to me and disappeared before I opened it, I assumed it had been sorted. When phone calls came for my parents and stopped when I picked up, I assumed privacy. When my brother mentioned things about figuring it out later, I assumed he meant his own plans. Every assumption I made worked against me. The most unsettling part was how normal it all felt. No one acted nervously, no one avoided eye contact. There was no tension in the room to warn me that a line was being crossed. That's how normalization works. You don't wake up one day and accept disrespect. You practice it. Slowly, in small moments where objecting feels like overreacting. I remember one evening, not long before graduation, when my father casually mentioned that paperwork was complicated, but we've used your information since it was cleaner. Cleaner! The word caught on something inside me. I asked what he meant. He waved it off. You don't have any issues, good credit, no complications. It's simpler that way. At the time, I didn't even know what good credit meant in practice. I just nodded, trusting that if it were important, someone would explain more. They didn't, and I didn't push. That was the moment I should have spoken. Not loudly, not angrily, just clearly. But clarity requires believing you're entitled to it. I had learned to equate questioning with conflict and conflict with selfishness. So instead, I internalized the discomfort and adjusted myself around it. I told myself, they're not hurting you. They're just stressed. They know what they're doing. Meanwhile, the language around me shifted subtly. We'll handle it for you. This helps everyone. You don't need to be involved. Each phrase positioned me as a beneficiary rather than a participant. Each one removed a little more agency while sounding generous. And because I didn't object, the behavior solidified. My brother benefited most from this arrangement. His setbacks were buffered, his risks are redistributed. When things didn't work out for him, there was always a workaround already in motion. I saw this, I felt it, and I still stayed quiet. Not because I agreed, but because I didn't yet understand the cost of disagreement. I thought silence kept the peace. I didn't realize it was keeping the system intact. By the time I moved into my dorm, I had been trained not to ask for details, to accept summaries instead of sources, to believe that if something involved my name, it must somehow serve me too. That belief lasted exactly 3 weeks. The call came on a Tuesday afternoon, a number I didn't recognize. I let it go to voicemail. Then it rang again, and again. When I finally answered, the voice on the other end asked for me by full name, then verified my date of birth, then began explaining overdue balances and repayment obligations. I remember sitting on my bed, staring at the cinder block wall, feeling my sense of reality tilt. There had been no single moment where someone said, "We're doing this without telling you." There had just been hundreds of moments where I allowed myself to be excluded. That's what normalization does. It convinces you that your absence is natural. And once absence becomes normal, using you without asking feels justified. I didn't scream, I didn't cry. I just listened. And for the first time, I stopped rationalizing what I was hearing. When the call ended, I didn't immediately understand what it meant. I wrote down the numbers the woman on the phone gave me. Loan services, account balances, dates. I copied them carefully into my notebook, the same way I'd always taken notes in class. Methodical, detached, as if precision alone could keep panic at bay. Only later did the shape of it start to form. What struck me first wasn't the amount of money. It was the certainty in her voice. She wasn't asking if the debt was mine. She was informing me that it was. As far as every system she represented was concerned, I had already agreed. That's when I began to see my role clearly. I wasn't the decision maker. I wasn't even the person being consulted. I was the foundation on which everything else had been built. My clean record, my predictable behavior, my unquestioning trust, all of it had made me useful. When I called home that night, the conversation was calm in a way that felt rehearsed. There was no denial, no surprise, just explanations delivered in a soothing tone, as if I were upset over a misunderstanding rather than a violation. We did what we had to do. It was temporary. You were always going to college anyway. This helps the family. The phrases stacked neatly on top of each other, forming something that sounded almost reasonable, if you didn't look too closely. I asked why no one had told me. There was a pause. Then my mother said, "We didn't think you'd react well." That sentence settled everything. It wasn't that they forgot to ask. It wasn't that they didn't think it mattered. They had decided my reaction was an inconvenience. In that moment, I understood the role I had been playing all along. I was the buffer, the insurance policy, the quiet one whose discomfort could be absorbed for the greater good. I wasn't angry yet. I was reorganizing, internally mapping years of interactions onto this new framework. Why was my input never needed? Why was my name considered clean? Why was my silence so comfortable for them? It hadn't been kindness. It had been permission. My brother spoke next. He sounded defensive, but not ashamed. "You were always better with this stuff," he said. It made sense. Made sense! That was the logic. Competence had become consent. Responsibility had been mistaken for availability. I realized then that my role wasn't accidental. It had been assigned gradually, reinforced every time I didn't object. Reliable, capable, invisible. The kind of person people build plans around without worrying she'll push back. What surprised me most was how little emotion there was in the room. No shouting, no tears, just a shared assumption that this was an unfortunate but necessary solution. They weren't trying to hurt me, they were trying to avoid inconvenience. And I was the easiest place to put it. That night, after the call, I sat alone in my dorm room and let the silence settle. For the first time, I didn't rush to soften what I felt. I didn't search for empathy for them. I didn't look for reasons to excuse it. I just let the clarity exist. I saw how my reliability had been interpreted as surrender, how my calm had been translated into compliance, how my role had solidified without my approval. This wasn't about money, it was about ownership of my name, my future, my agents. I understood then that nothing would change if I reacted emotionally. They were prepared for that. They had explanations ready. What they weren't prepared for was me stepping out of the role entirely. Not with anger, with precision. That realization didn't bring relief. It brought responsibility. Because once you see the role you've been assigned, you have a choice. Continue playing it or quietly rewrite it. That night, I closed my notebook and made a decision. Not about confrontation, but about control. I would stop being useful in ways I never agreed to. The shift didn't happen all at once. There was no dramatic moment where I stood up, packed my bags, or declared anything out loud. In fact, from the outside, that day looked almost identical to every other day I'd had since moving into the dorm. Classes, library, a quiet dinner eaten alone. But internally, something had loosened, and then reset itself into a new position. Up until then, I had been reacting, absorbing information, letting it pass through me while I searched for the correct emotional response. Shock, anger, betrayal. I assumed one of those would eventually arrive and tell me what to do next. Instead, what arrived was clarity. I was sitting in the student union, reviewing my notes from the call, when I realized something that hadn't occurred to me before. No one had asked me to fix this. No one had apologized in a way that suggested responsibility. No one had asked what I wanted to do next. They had explained, justified, smoothed. which meant they still saw this as manageable, not wrong. That understanding changed everything. I stopped thinking in terms of how I felt and started thinking in terms of what existed. Documents existed, accounts existed, legal obligations existed, attached to my name, not my intentions. Feelings wouldn't move those. I walked to the campus financial aid office that afternoon, not to accuse or demand anything, just to ask neutral questions. The kind that begins with, "I'm trying to understand." What I learned there wasn't shocking. It was procedural. Yes, the loans were real. Yes, they had been taken out before I graduated high school. Yes, they were legally tied to me. The counselor didn't ask why. She didn't speculate. She just explained the system as it was designed. And in doing so, she gave me my first sense of footing. Systems don't care about family dynamics. They respond to documentation. As I walked back to my dorm, I felt something unfamiliar. Steadiness. Not hope. Not rage. Just a quiet sense that I no longer needed to wait for someone else to do the right thing. That night, I opened my notebook again. But this time, I didn't write questions. I wrote timelines, dates, signatures, points of access. I mapped what I knew and what I didn't, where information lived, who had touched it, when. It wasn't obsessive, it was grounding. For the first time, I wasn't asking why they did this. I was asking what I could verify. That distinction mattered. I didn't confront anyone. I didn't even mention that I was learning more. Silence, I realized, could be repurposed. It didn't have to be an absence. It could be space. Space to think, space to prepare, space to choose deliberately instead of reactively. That was the day something shifted. Not in them, in me. I stopped trying to be understood and started focusing on being effective. When my family called over the next few days, I kept my tone neutral. I listened. I let them talk themselves into comfort. Their explanations grew more confident the longer I didn't interrupt. They assumed my quiet meant acceptance. It didn't. It meant I was no longer wasting energy managing their feelings. I remember lying in bed one night, staring at the ceiling, and realizing that I didn't feel afraid anymore. The worst part, the not knowing, was over. I knew enough to move forward. And I knew something else, too. This wouldn't be fixed with a single conversation. It would be resolved through a series of small, irreversible steps. I wasn't planning revenge. I wasn't planning exposure. I was planning alignment between my name and my choices. The version of me that had been assigned a role would have tried to smooth this over, would have looked for a compromise that kept everyone comfortable. That version of me was gone. In her place was someone quieter, but far more precise. I closed my notebook and set it on my desk, not as a symbol, but as a tool. From that point on, silence wasn't something that happened to me. It was something I chose. Once silence became intentional, everything sounded different. Conversations that once felt overwhelming now felt revealing. I noticed pauses, assumptions, the way people relaxed when they believed they had nothing to fear from me. My family spoke freely again. They told me not to stress. They reminded me how much they'd sacrificed. They assured me it would all work out in the end. I let them talk, not because I agreed, but because listening without reacting gave me information. People reveal their logic when they think the outcome is already decided. My brother was the most comfortable of all. He joked about how confusing paperwork was, how lucky it was that I was good with details. He spoke as if the problem had already moved past the point of consequence. I didn't correct him. I had learned something important. Confrontation would only invite negotiation. And negotiation assumed shared authority over something that was mine alone. So I stayed quiet, and used that quiet strategically. I began requesting copies of documents, framing it as an organization. I asked for login details in case something came up. I requested statements the way someone would ask for spare keys, casually, without urgency. No one refused. Why would they? I wasn't acting upset. I wasn't making demands. I was still playing the role they recognized. Reliable, helpful, contained. Every document I received went into my notebook, cross-referenced with dates and notes. I compared signatures. I noted inconsistencies. I learned the language of loan services and credit bureaus the same way I'd learned academic jargon, slowly, carefully, without emotion. Silence gave me access. While they talked about fixing it later, I learned what later actually meant in contractual terms. While they assumed time would soften things, I learned how time hardens records. What surprised me was how empowering it felt not to explain myself. For years, I had equated silence with weakness because it came from fear of conflict. This silence came from clarity. It didn't drain me, it focused me. There were moments when anger tried to surface, late at night, in the quiet between tasks, but I didn't let it steer. Anger wants witnesses, clarity wants outcomes. I chose outcomes. My family mistook my composure for relief. They thought I'd accepted their reasoning, that I'd come around. They didn't notice the shift in how I asked questions, or the way I stopped sharing personal details, or how I began to separate myself emotionally from their expectations. I wasn't punishing them, I was recalibrating. The silence changed the power dynamic in a way none of us acknowledged out loud. Without resistance, they had no friction to push against. They continued as if the matter was settled. Meanwhile, I was positioning myself where facts mattered more than narratives. I met with advisors, I read policies, I learned my rights without announcing that I was doing so. Each step was small, unremarkable on its own, but together they formed something solid. The irony wasn't lost on me. The same traits that had made me easy to overlook were now making me impossible to manipulate. Patience, attention to detail, a willingness to wait. I didn't raise my voice, I didn't threaten, I didn't demand apologies. I let the system speak for me when the time came, because silence, when chosen, isn't emptiness. It's restraint, and restraint, when misunderstood, creates an opening. They believed I was still playing my assigned role. I knew I was preparing to step out of it entirely. What they never noticed was how much I was learning while they were relaxing. From their perspective, the situation had stabilized. I wasn't calling every day. I wasn't asking hard questions anymore. I wasn't crying or threatening or demanding explanations. In their minds, that meant the problem had softened. They mistook my quiet for relief. In reality, I had entered a phase of preparation that required no announcement. I started with my credit report. Seeing it in full was sobering, not emotionally, but structurally. Accounts listed, balances attached, timelines that didn't match my lived experience. My name appeared again and again, cleanly typed, confidently asserted. The system didn't know me as a person. It knew me as a data set. That realization changed how I approached everything. I stopped thinking of this as a family conflict and started treating it as an identity misalignment. Somewhere along the way, my name had been separated from my consent. My task was to reunite them, quietly. I learned how disputes worked. Not the emotional version people imagine, but the procedural one. What counted as proof? What timelines mattered? What language triggered reviews? And what language delayed them? I didn't rush. Rushing leaves fingerprints. Instead, I documented every conversation I could recall. I dated and summarized. Every explanation I'd been given, I wrote down verbatim. Not to argue later, but to establish consistency. Truth, I learned, isn't just what happened, it's what can be demonstrated repeatedly without contradiction. I noticed patterns I hadn't seen before. How often my brother's setbacks coincided with sudden solutions. How my parents spoke about risk, always as something abstract, never as something I might personally bear. How my name had become shorthand for stability. They never noticed me asking fewer questions emotionally and more questions operationally. They never noticed that I stopped using phrases like "I feel" and started using "Can you send me?" Or "What date was that processed?" Or both processed? Or "Who signed that section?" Those questions didn't sound threatening. They sounded responsible. And responsibility had always been my cover. I learned about statutes and timelines, about the difference between authorization and assumption. I learned how institutions respond when they realize a narrative doesn't align with documentation. I also learned when not to act. There's a temptation, when you uncover leverage, to use it immediately, to prove to yourself that you're no longer powerless. I resisted that. Power used too early often collapses under its own weight. Instead, I positioned myself. I made sure my own records were impeccable. I made sure my communication was calm and consistent. I made sure that if anyone ever reviewed my actions, they would see restraint, not reaction. Meanwhile, my family continued as they always had. They spoke about the future casually, as if this were a closed chapter. They assumed I would figure it out, the way I always had. They planned around me again, still without asking. What they didn't see was that I had stopped absorbing their expectations. I wasn't angry with them anymore. Anger requires engagement. I was past that. What I felt instead was distance, not coldness, clarity. I could see how easily my silence had been misread in the past, and how that misreading had enabled everything that followed. I could also see how their comfort depended on my predictability, so I stayed predictable until I wasn't. Preparation is invisible by design. If people notice it, you're doing it wrong. The strongest moves are made long before anyone realizes a game is being played. By the time I finished gathering what I needed, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt ready. There was no dramatic moment where I said, "I've got them now." There was just a quiet certainty that when the time came, I wouldn't need to argue. The facts would speak. And for the first time since this began, I wasn't waiting for something to happen to me. I was deciding when to act. The reveal didn't come with adrenaline. There was no rush, no spike of emotion, no moment where I leaned back and thought, "I've won." What arrived instead was something far more sobering. Clarity. I was sitting alone in a quiet corner of the library when everything finally aligned. Not as a theory, but as a verified sequence of events. Dates matched, access points overlapped, signatures told a story no one had intended to tell out loud. This was the moment I privately understood the full scope of what had happened. Not just that, loans had been taken out in my name, but how they had been taken out? Who had access? Who had signed? Who had known? And when? It wasn't a mystery anymore. It was a structure. And once you see a structure, you stop personalizing it. I didn't feel rage toward my brother in that moment. I felt something quieter and more unsettling. Recognition. He hadn't acted alone, but he also hadn't been stopped. He had moved within a system that allowed him to borrow credibility he didn't have. Mine. What struck me most was how avoidable it all had been. One conversation, one boundary, one decision to treat me as a person instead of a resource. Instead, they had relied on something else, my predictability. The private reveal wasn't about uncovering a secret villain or a shocking betrayal. It was about understanding that no one involved believed I would ever force accountability. They assumed discomfort would keep me compliant. That assumption was the leverage. I sat there for a long time, not doing anything with the information yet. I needed to feel the weight of it without rushing to relieve it. That's how I knew I was ready. Because when you act too quickly, you're still trying to escape the feeling. When you can sit with it, you're acting from choice. I reviewed my notes again, not to find errors, but to confirm consistency. The story the documents told was the same no matter how I approached it. This wasn't miscommunication. It wasn't confusion. It wasn't urgency gone too far. It was a decision repeated enough times to feel normal. That realization closed the door on one option I had been quietly considering. Fixing this internally. Quiet apologies, family agreements, informal promises. There was nothing left to negotiate. You can't negotiate with a structure that doesn't recognize your authority. You dismantle it, or you remove yourself from it. I chose removal, not emotionally, procedurally. The most powerful part of the reveal was understanding that I didn't need to convince anyone of anything. The system already had rules for this kind of misalignment. It didn't care about intentions, it cared about authorization. And authorization was something I had never given. I remember thinking, not with bitterness, but with finality. They assumed I wouldn't use this. They were right for a long time, just not forever. I closed my notebook and didn't add anything else that day. There was nothing more to learn. The preparation phase was complete. From that moment on, every step would have consequences. Not emotional ones, structural ones. I didn't feel powerful. I felt responsible because clarity comes with obligation. Once you know exactly what's been done, choosing not to act is no longer neutrality, it's consent. And I was done consenting. The hardest part wasn't deciding what I could do. It was deciding which version of myself I was willing to live with afterward. Up until that point, my options had existed in theory. Clean, abstract, emotionally neutral. I could keep handling the payments quietly. I could negotiate privately. I could ask for help, accept partial responsibility, and absorb the rest like I always had. Those paths were familiar, comfortable in a way. They all preserved the image of harmony. They also all required one thing from me, continued self-erasure. I thought about the version of my future those choices would create. Years of financial limitation were tied to a decision I never made. Ongoing explanations, silent resentment that would have nowhere to go. That future felt heavy. Then there was the other path, The one I hadn't said out loud yet, not even to myself. It wasn't about punishment. It wasn't about exposing anyone publicly. It was about alignment, about refusing to carry responsibility for actions that weren't mine. I weighed the cost carefully. I knew that choosing accountability would disrupt the narrative my family had built. It would cause discomfort. It would fracture the version of me they were used to. And once I took that step, there would be no returning to the role of the agreeable one. I sat with that reality for days, not in distress, but in assessment. Was I prepared to be misunderstood? Was I willing to let go of being seen as easy? Could I tolerate their disappointment without trying to soften it? Those questions mattered more than the financial ones. Because money can be rebuilt, identity is harder. What finally tipped the scale was a quiet, unexpected thought. If I don't correct this, I'm teaching them, and myself, that my consent is optional. That wasn't a lesson I was willing to carry forward. The decision, when it came, was unceremonious. No dramatic declaration, just a clear internal line. I would pursue formal correction. I would use the systems designed for this purpose. I would stop cushioning the consequences. Not aggressively, not vindictively, decisively. I didn't tell my family right away. The decision wasn't for them. It was for me. Announcing it would only invite persuasion, guilt, and urgency designed to slow me down. Instead, I took the first irreversible step quietly. I submitted documentation. That single action did more than months of conversation ever could. It set timelines in motion that no amount of explanation could undo. As soon as I clicked submit, I felt something settle. Not relief exactly, but resolve. The kind that doesn't need validation. I knew that once this process began, outcomes would follow that were no longer mine to negotiate. That was the point. For the first time, I wasn't managing how anyone else felt about what was happening. I wasn't absorbing discomfort to protect the group. I was protecting myself. There's a myth that accountability is loud. It needs confrontation, ultimatums, and raised voices. In reality, the most permanent changes often start quietly. Inside systems that don't argue, don't negotiate, and don't forget. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt aligned. And alignment, I learned, is far more powerful than approval. Once the process was underway, there was nothing left to explain. That was the strange relief of it. I had spent so much of my life translating myself, softening edges, clarifying intentions, reassuring others, that the absence of explanation felt almost unfamiliar. I moved quietly, but not passively. Each step I took was procedural, documented, and final in ways that didn't require emotional reinforcement. I responded to requests for information promptly. I kept copies of everything. I followed timelines exactly. From the outside, nothing appeared to be happening. I still went to class. I still answered family calls. I still sounded like myself. That's what made it effective. My family assumed time was smoothing things out. They interpreted my continued calm as closure. In their minds, this was a difficult episode that would eventually fade into a story about stress and misunderstanding. They didn't notice the shift in how I spoke. I stopped seeking reassurance. I stopped offering emotional updates. I stopped filling silences. I spoke when necessary, and only about neutral facts. When my mother asked if things were getting better, I said, "They're being handled." That was true. When my brother joked about how complicated everything was, I nodded and let the conversation move on. I didn't correct him. Correction wasn't my role anymore. Behind the scenes, systems were responding. Requests triggered reviews. Reviews triggered notifications. Notifications triggered internal processes that no individual could override with a phone call or an apology. That's the thing about formal action. It removes the need for performance. I didn't need to justify myself. I didn't need to persuade. I didn't need to remind anyone of what I deserved. The structure did that for me. There were moments when I felt the urge to say something, to warn them maybe, to prepare them, but I resisted. Not out of cruelty, out of respect for my own decision. Once you choose alignment, you don't dilute it with preemptive comfort. I knew what was coming. They didn't. And that asymmetry wasn't something I needed to correct. As days turned into weeks, subtle shifts began to appear. My parents grew quieter on the phone. Conversations felt slightly more tentative, as if they were waiting for something they couldn't name. I stayed steady. I wasn't hiding, I just wasn't volunteering. There's a difference. Moving in silence doesn't mean moving in secret. It means letting actions speak at the volume they're designed to have. And these actions were designed to be heard by institutions, not by people who had already decided how they felt. The irony wasn't lost on me. For years, my family had relied on my predictability. Now that same predictability was carrying me through a process they couldn't interrupt. I wasn't improvising. I wasn't reacting. I was following through. There's a particular kind of peace that comes from doing exactly what you said you would do, even if you never said it out loud. I slept better during that period. Not because the situation was resolved, but because I wasn't split anymore. My actions matched my values. No one had to agree. No one had to understand. Alignment doesn't ask for permission. The first sign wasn't anger. It was confusion. My mother called one afternoon and asked if I'd received some kind of letter. Her voice carried a lightness that felt practiced, like she was trying not to alarm herself. I said yes. I didn't elaborate. There was a pause on the line. "Do you know what it's about?" she asked. "I have an idea," I said, calm neutral. That was the moment the consequences began. Not with confrontation, but with uncertainty. From there, things unfolded the way systems always do. Gradually, then all at once. My parents started asking more questions. Not accusatory ones, searching ones. They wanted to know timelines, steps, and what I'd been told. They spoke carefully, as if still assuming this was a misunderstanding that could be smoothed over with the right explanation. I didn't provide one, not because I couldn't, because explanations had never protected me before. I noticed a subtle shift in tone over the next few conversations. The confidence drained first, then the assumptions, then the casual language. They were trying to re-enter a process they had assumed was finished. It wasn't. My brother stopped joking. He started calling at odd hours, asking indirect questions, testing the edges of the situation without naming it directly. "Do you think they'll reverse anything?" he asked once. "I don't know," I said. What I did know was that reversibility had never been guaranteed. They had just assumed it. As notices continued to arrive, panic began to replace confusion. Not explosive panic, quiet, restless panic, the kind that leaks into conversations and disrupts sleep. They started referencing how much we've all been through. They reminded me of family history, shared sacrifices, everything we'd weathered together. It was a familiar strategy. Emotional context as leverage. I didn't push back. I didn't engage. I listened the way I always had. Except now, listening wasn't submission. It was an observation. The difference between this phase and everything before it was simple. The consequences were no longer theoretical. For the first time, something they couldn't talk their way out of was happening. I heard it in the way my father's voice tightened when he asked about the next steps. In how my mother started saying "we" again, as if collective language might redistribute responsibility. And in the way, my brother finally said, "I didn't think it would go this far." That sentence told me everything. He hadn't believed there would be an endpoint that excluded him. He'd assumed discomfort, not accountability. I didn't correct him. I didn't need to. The system was doing what it was designed to do. Separate facts from feelings. I didn't feel satisfaction watching this unfold. I felt distance, not emotional withdrawal, clarity of boundaries. I was no longer inside their reactions. I was adjacent to them. They were experiencing the consequences of assumptions they had never questioned. I was experiencing alignment for the first time. That distinction mattered. There were moments when I sensed regret in their voices. Not for what they had done, but for the loss of control. For the realization that they could no longer manage the narrative through reassurance alone. And that was the quiet turning point. Not when they apologized, not when they panicked, but when they realized I wasn't stepping in to absorb the impact anymore. By the time they understood what was happening, the window they thought they had was already closed. At first, they treated it like a delay, a bureaucratic snag, something that required the right phone call, the right tone, the right explanation. My parents had always believed that if you were polite enough, reasonable enough, systems would bend. They didn't realize this system wasn't listening for politeness. It was listening for authorization. My mother calls more often now. Not to ask questions anymore, but to propose solutions. "We can make a plan," she said. "We can sort this out privately." Privately. That word had lost its comfort. Private solutions were what had created this situation in the first place. Private decisions, private assumptions, private use of my name. I told her I understood she wanted to fix it. I told her I wasn't trying to hurt anyone. Both things were true. What I didn't say was that fixing it had already moved beyond intention. My father took a different approach. He grew quiet, then firm. He spoke about responsibility, about family loyalty, about how some things shouldn't be handled this way. This way, I realized, meant without their control. They weren't asking how to make things right. They were asking how to make things stop. My brother sounded the most unsettled of all. He called late one night and finally dropped the indirect language. "I didn't think you'd actually do anything," he said. There it was. "No, I'm sorry, not I was wrong. Just surprise." I let the silence sit between us long enough for it to register. "I needed to," I said. That was all. He tried to bargain after that. Promises, reassurances, plans that required trust but offered no structure. He spoke quickly, as if momentum might save him. I didn't interrupt. When he finished, I said, "I can't undo what's already in motion." That was the moment panic surfaced. Real panic, unfiltered by confidence. He asked what that meant. What would happen next, if there was still time? I didn't speculate. Speculation creates hope where there shouldn't be any. "I don't control the process," I said. "I just started it." That sentence changed the room, even from miles away. For the first time, they understood that this wasn't about me deciding something. It was about me no longer absorbing something. The irony was sharp. They had been comfortable making irreversible decisions when they believed I would carry them. Now they were terrified of irreversibility. Too late. Not in a cruel sense, in a literal one. The timelines had passed, reviews had begun, records were being examined by people who didn't know us and didn't need to. My parents oscillated between regret and frustration. They apologized, carefully, conditionally, always paired with explanations about stress, pressure, and fear. I listened. I acknowledged the emotions. I didn't reverse course. Because this wasn't about punishment, it was about correction. I could feel the pull to step back in, to soothe, to soften, to take responsibility for the emotional fallout. That reflex was still there. Years of practice don't disappear overnight. But I didn't act on it. I stayed with the discomfort, theirs and mine. That's how I knew the shift was real. When you've spent your life being the one who makes things easier, doing nothing can feel like harm. But sometimes, doing nothing is the only way to stop the cycle. They wanted time. Time to adjust, time to explain, time to negotiate. What they didn't understand was that time had already been used, just not by me. And now, for the first time, they were living inside the consequences of that choice. The confrontation, when it finally happened, didn't look like what people imagined. There was no raised voice, no list of grievances was read aloud, no demand for remorse. It happened at the kitchen table, where so many decisions had been made without me. I had come home for the weekend visit after weeks of careful distance. By then, everyone knew enough to be uneasy, but not enough to feel grounded. The air in the house felt restrained, like everyone was holding their breath, waiting for something dramatic. It never came. We sat down. Coffee cooled in mugs. No one reached for it. My mother spoke first. She apologized again, more directly this time. She said she hadn't realized how serious it would become. She said she never meant for me to feel used. I listened without interrupting. When she finished, I said, "I believe you didn't intend harm." That mattered to her. I could see it. Then I added, "But intention isn't what determined the outcome." The room went quiet. My father leaned back in his chair and asked, finally, what I wanted. It was the first time anyone had asked me that question, without an agenda attached. "I want my name to reflect my choices," I said. Nothing more. There was no accusation in my voice, no edge, just a statement of alignment. My brother hadn't said anything yet. He stared at the table, jaw tight. When he finally looked up, he asked, "Wasn't there another way?" I met his eyes. "There were many ways," I said. "This is the one that didn't require me to disappear." That landed differently than anger would have. He nodded slowly, not in agreement, but in understanding. Or at least in recognition. No one argued after that. There was nothing left to negotiate. The process was already moving. What remained was emotional reckoning. Not for me, but for them. I didn't demand accountability out loud. I didn't need to. It was already embedded in what was happening. We talked for a while longer. About boundaries this time. About communication. About what would and wouldn't happen going forward. I was clear, calm, unyielding without being harsh. I wasn't asking for trust. I was setting conditions. When I left that weekend, there was no sense of victory, just a quiet finality. The roles had shifted permanently. I was no longer the buffer, no longer the unspoken solution, no longer the person whose silence made everything easier. And I didn't feel the need to explain that. What changed afterward wasn't loud or immediate. There was no clean break where everything suddenly felt resolved. No moment where the past stopped existing. What changed was subtler and far more lasting. I changed the way I occupy space. For a long time, my identity had been built around being the reasonable one, the stable one, the person who made things work quietly so no one else had to feel uncomfortable. That identity had earned me praise, trust, and a sense of belonging. But it had also taught others how far they could go without asking. Letting go of that version of myself felt disorienting at first. I wasn't colder, I wasn't harder, I was clearer. I stopped volunteering to absorb other people's consequences. I stopped translating my boundaries into apologies. I stopped explaining myself to people who benefited from misunderstanding me. That shift didn't make me less compassionate. It made my compassion intentional. With my family, the relationship recalibrated slowly. Conversations became more careful. Decisions were discussed instead of assumed. There was distance, but also respect that hadn't existed before. Not because they suddenly understood everything I'd been through, but because they understood something simpler. My silence was no longer available for use. In my own life, the change showed up in small, practical ways. I read contracts carefully. I asked questions early. I trusted discomfort as information instead of something to smooth over. I no longer confuse peace with passivity. There's a difference between being calm and being compliant. I had spent years blurring that line. Now I could see it clearly. I didn't become suspicious of everyone. I didn't move through the world expecting betrayal. What I did gain was discernment, the ability to tell when trust was being invited versus when it was being assumed. That distinction has shaped every relationship since. I'm still quiet, still reflective, still someone people underestimate at first. The difference is that now I let them. Underestimation creates space. Space creates leverage. And leverage, when paired with restraint, becomes stability. I don't tell this story because I'm proud of the outcome. I tell it because it taught me something fundamental about self-respect. You don't need to announce your boundaries for them to be real. You don't need anger for accountability to exist. And you don't need to become someone else to reclaim yourself. I am still the same person who values fairness, empathy, and responsibility. I just no longer sacrifice myself to prove it. What I carry now isn't bitterness. It's alignment. My name belongs to me again. My choices reflect my values. And my silence, when I choose it, is no longer mistaken for consent. That's who I am now. When people hear this story, they often ask me how it ended. They want a clean conclusion. A final scene where everything balances out neatly, where everyone understands, apologizes properly, and moves forward in harmony. Real life doesn't work that way. What I got wasn't closure in the cinematic sense. What I got was something quieter and more durable. Ownership. Ownership of my name. Ownership of my decisions. Ownership of the space I occupy in other people's lives. There are still moments when the past brushes up against the present. Family dynamics don't reset overnight. Trust doesn't regenerate just because accountability has been enforced. Some things remain tender. Some conversations remain careful. And that's okay. Because healing isn't about restoring what was. It's about refusing to repeat what was harmful. The most important lesson this experience taught me is one we don't talk about enough. Being easy to deal with is not the same as being respected. Sometimes people don't cross boundaries because they're cruel. They cross them because the boundary was never enforced, and because they believed you would carry the weight quietly. I don't blame my younger self for staying silent. She did what she thought was necessary to survive and belong. She didn't know that silence, left unchecked, could be repurposed. But I honor the version of me who noticed, who documented, who chose alignment over approval. There was no shouting, no humiliation, no revenge, just consequences moving through the channels they were designed to move through. That's what quiet dominance actually looks like. Not overpowering others, not proving superiority, but refusing to be used as infrastructure for someone else's choices. If you take anything from this story, let it be this. You are allowed to correct what was done in your name. You are allowed to step out of roles you never agreed to. And you are allowed to let systems, not emotions, do the work when words have failed. Silence isn't weakness. It's a tool. And like any tool, its power depends on who's using it and why. If this story resonated with you, I'd like to hear from you. Not because I need validation, but because stories like this are more common than people admit. So here's my question for you. Have you ever realized that staying quiet kept the peace for everyone else, but cost you something you didn't get back? If you have, you're not alone.